God's favor is ready to shake things up. These words carry a sense of divine promise, a sense of anticipation, and a powerful call to action. What does it mean for God's favor to be upon us, and what happens when it begins to shake things up in our lives, our communities, and in the world at large? This message is not just about waiting for change, but actively preparing for the overwhelming transformation that is about to take place. The shaking that will occur is not one of destruction, but of renewal, realignment, and rebirth. It is a clarion call for all of us to rise, to step into our God-given destiny, and to witness His mighty hand move in ways we could not have imagined. When we think about God's favor, we often think of blessings, abundance, and a sense of peace. But God's favor is not just about comfort, it is also about challenge. It is not always about remaining in a place of security, but about being led into new territories, sometimes even those that may seem uncertain or unfamiliar. His favor is not passive. It is active, moving us, guiding us, and sometimes disrupting our normal ways of living so that we can be elevated to higher purposes and new horizons. In the Bible, we see numerous examples of God's favor shaking things up. Look at the story of Joseph, who was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, and falsely accused of a crime. Yet, in the end, God's favor lifted him from the lowest depths of despair to the highest position in Egypt. The story of Joseph is a testament to how God's favor works through difficult circumstances, shaking up everything we think we know about success, justice, and timing. God's favor took what seemed like a series of unfortunate events and turned them into the fulfillment of a divine destiny. Consider also the story of Moses, who was called to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. When Moses first encountered God in the burning bush, he had doubts, fears, and insecurities. But God's favor was upon him, and despite his initial hesitation, Moses was empowered to confront Pharaoh and lead the people into freedom. The favor of God didn't just protect Moses, it broke the chains of an entire nation. This is another example of how God's favor shakes things up. It disrupts systems, breaks down barriers, and leads to liberty. And let us not forget about the early church. The apostles, led by Peter and Paul, were empowered by the favor of God to perform miracles, preach the gospel with boldness, and establish the Christian faith amidst persecution and opposition. The early church was not a group of people huddling in safety. They were a movement that shook the foundations of the Roman Empire. God's favor upon them stirred up a revival that still affects the world today. When God's favor is truly upon a people, it causes the impossible to become possible. It doesn't just change individuals, it changes society. But what does this mean for us today? If God's favor is truly ready to shake things up in our lives, how do we prepare? How do we position ourselves to receive this divine intervention and allow it to transform us? The first thing we must do is recognize that God's favor is not earned. It is not based on our performance, our titles, or our status. It is given freely by a God who loves us unconditionally. His favor is a gift, and we must be open to receiving it. However, receiving God's favor does not mean sitting idly by and waiting for things to happen. It means being actively involved in the process. It means seeking His will, aligning our hearts with His purposes, and being willing to step out in faith even when the path is unclear. God's favor often calls us to take risks, to step into unknown territory, and to trust Him in the midst of uncertainty. It is a call to action, not passivity. We also need to recognize that when God's favor begins to shake things up, it is not always comfortable. It might bring challenges, discomfort, and even opposition. Just as the Israelites faced the Red Sea before they could be delivered, or just as the apostles faced persecution before the gospel spread, we too may find ourselves in situations where we are stretched, tested, and even refined. But these challenges are not signs of God's absence. They are signs of His presence, His favor, and His willingness to shape us into the people He has called us to be. One of the key things we must remember is that God's favor is not just about personal gain or success. It is about the larger picture, the bigger purpose. When God favors us, it is not merely for our benefit. It is for the benefit of others, for the sake of his kingdom. This is why God's favor often leads us to places of service, to areas where we can make a difference, and to situations where we can be a blessing to others. As we receive God's favor, we must also become conduits of that favor, sharing his blessings with those around us and using our position and influence to lift others up. It is also important to understand that when God's favor shakes things up, it can change not just our circumstances, but also our priorities. The things that once seemed important, wealth, status, power, may become secondary to the greater call of God on our lives. We may find ourselves reassessing our values, our goals, and our relationships, aligning them more closely with God's purposes. This process of realignment is often uncomfortable, but it is necessary if we are to walk in the fullness of his favor. God's favor, when it shakes things up, also calls us to be bold. It calls us to step out in faith, even when the odds seem stacked against us. Just as Peter stepped out of the boat and walked on water, so too are we called to take bold steps when God beckons us. It is not enough to simply talk about faith. We must live it, taking action in accordance with God's will, even when we do not know exactly where it will lead. Sometimes we might find ourselves wondering if God's favor is truly upon us, especially when things are not going according to our plans. In those moments, we must remember that God's ways are higher than our ways, and his timing is perfect. What seems like a delay, a setback, or even a failure might be part of a larger plan that is unfolding. God's favor is not always about instant results. It is about long-term transformation. His favor often works behind the scenes, orchestrating circumstances in ways that we cannot yet see, preparing us for the blessings that are to come. Furthermore, when God's favor shakes things up, it is a reminder that we are not in control. As human beings, we like to have control over our circumstances, our environments, and our outcomes. But when God's favor is at work, it often takes us out of our comfort zones and shows us that we are not the ones steering the ship. Instead, we are called to trust in the one who holds the world in his hands. This can be intimidating, but it is also liberating. We no longer have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. We can rest in the assurance that God is in control and he will never lead us where his favor cannot sustain us. As we look to the future, we must remember that God's favor is not just something that we hope for, it is something that we are called to actively pursue. We must seek his presence, align our lives with his purposes, and be willing to step out in faith when he calls. The shaking that will take place is not something to fear, it is something to embrace. It is a sign that God is moving, that he is at work, and that he is preparing us for something greater. God's favor is ready to shake things up in ways that we cannot yet fully comprehend. It is a divine invitation to rise, to move, to act, and to be part of a greater story than we could ever imagine. This is not a time to be passive, to sit back and wait for things to happen. This is a time to step into the fullness of God's favor, to trust in his timing, and to be bold in the face of whatever challenges may come our way. For when God's favor shakes things up, everything changes for the better, for the kingdom, and for his glory. So let us be ready. Let us be open to the shaking. Let us position ourselves to receive the favor of God, knowing that it will not only transform us, but also the world around us. The time has come for a mighty move of God, and his favor is ready to shake things up. Are we ready to receive it? The choice is ours. God's favor is a divine invitation that transcends our human understanding of what it means to be chosen or blessed. It is not something that we can earn through our good deeds, our titles, or our social standing. The concept of earning God's favor is counter to what the Bible teaches us, where God's grace is extended to us not based on our merit, but on his love for us. We are invited into his favor because of his goodness, not because of our perfection. The nature of God's favor is rooted in his unconditional love, a love that does not depend on how well we perform or how righteous we appear, but on his desire to see us walk in the fullness of our created purpose. In life, we often experience situations where we work hard, strive for success, or wait for recognition. We look for validation from the world, from people, or from circumstances. This can leave us feeling empty or disappointed when things don't go as expected or when our efforts seem to go unnoticed. But God's favor breaks this cycle. It is not contingent on human approval or achievements. It is an act of divine grace that calls us to something higher. The favor of God doesn't merely uplift us in the eyes of others, it elevates us in the purpose and calling that God has placed on our lives, allowing us to step into our divine destiny. This calling is greater than any worldly success. It is about finding fulfillment in knowing that we are walking according to God's plan for us. One of the most remarkable aspects of God's favor is that it often invites us into a deeper relationship with him. It compels us to engage more fully with his will and to trust him in ways we might not have considered before. This invitation is not just to experience blessings or success, but to enter into a transformational process. We are not just recipients of favor, we are participants in the kingdom of God, called to live out the purposes he has uniquely designed for us. However, walking in God's favor often requires us to step out of our comfort zones. It calls us to embrace the unknown, to let go of control, and to follow God's lead even when we don't know where he is taking us. The favor of God doesn't promise a life free from challenges, but it assures us that no matter the obstacles we face, we are not facing them alone. Just like the story of Abraham, who was called to leave his family and homeland to go to a place he had never seen, God's favor sometimes calls us to take leaps of faith. Abraham had no idea what lay ahead, but he trusted God's promise, and because of that trust, he stepped into a destiny greater than he could have imagined. God's favor is an invitation to do the same, to trust him with the unknowns in our lives, knowing that he will lead us to a higher purpose. When we receive God's favor, we are essentially being called into a higher standard of living. It's easy to think of favor as simply a ticket to personal prosperity or happiness, but it goes beyond that. God's favor is designed to align us with his will, to shape us into the people he created us to be, and to empower us to serve his purposes in the world. The idea of stepping into a higher purpose can be intimidating because it requires growth, change, and sometimes sacrifice. But God's favor is not just a blessing for us, it is a blessing that enables us to bless others. As we walk in the favor of God, we are entrusted with more responsibility to impact lives, to make a difference, and to bring light into the dark places. There are countless examples in Scripture of individuals who responded to God's invitation to favor with transformative results. Joseph, for instance, was chosen by God and favored despite the betrayal by his brothers, the hardship of slavery, and the false accusations that led him to prison. What seemed like a series of misfortunes was, in fact, God's favor working behind the scenes, positioning Joseph to save a nation and fulfill a divine purpose. Joseph did not earn his favor, it was freely given, but his ability to recognize God's hand at work, even in the darkest moments, allowed him to step into the greater purpose for which he was chosen. Similarly, the story of David illustrates how God's favor is not determined by outward appearances or societal status. David was the youngest son, a shepherd boy overlooked by his own family, but God chose him to be king of Israel. When Samuel came to anoint the new king, God reminded him that he does not look at outward appearance, but at the heart. David's life, filled with challenges, victories, and failures, reveals how God's favor calls us to grow, mature, and become leaders even when we feel unqualified or unworthy. These stories show us that God's favor is not about our performance. It's about his plan for us. His favor is an invitation to trust in his timing, to walk in faith even when we don't understand the path, and to know that He will provide what we need to fulfill our purpose. God's favor calls us to let go of our need to control every aspect of our lives and instead surrender to His will. As we do so, we find that His favor leads us not only to greater blessing, but also to a deeper sense of fulfillment. The invitation to walk in God's favor is an invitation to become more like Christ, to live selflessly, to serve others, and to carry the light of God's truth into a dark world. It's about being transformed from the inside out. It's not about accumulating wealth or status, but about growing in grace, love, and wisdom. God's favor leads us to become vessels of His peace, His justice, and His mercy. In our modern world, where success is often measured by external achievements, wealth, or popularity, God's favor invites us into a different kind of success, the kind that is measured by our alignment with His will and our impact on the lives of others. As we respond to God's favor, we can be assured that He will equip us with everything we need to accomplish the task He has set before us. The process may not always be easy, but it will always be purposeful. So when we receive God's favor, we are not just receiving blessings. We are being invited to enter into a deeper relationship with Him, to live with a sense of purpose, and to step into a destiny greater than we could ever imagine. It's an invitation to transformation, to rise above the ordinary and to walk in the fullness of God's plan for our lives. When we accept this invitation, we are not just changed for the better. We are part of something much bigger, something eternal, something that will impact the world and bring glory to God's name. When God's favor begins to move in our lives, it often brings with it a kind of divine shaking, an unsettling of the very things we thought were stable. It doesn't merely keep things the same or preserve the status quo. It disrupts and rearranges our world in ways that challenge us, stretch us, and ultimately push us toward a higher purpose. This shaking is not about destruction, but about transformation. It's not about tearing things down for the sake of chaos. It's about breaking old systems, mindsets, and comforts to make room for renewal and growth. God's favor comes with the power to realign our priorities, to reorient us toward His will, and to set us on a path that leads to deeper fulfillment and purpose. When we encounter the favor of God, we may feel as though our life has been turned upside down. The things we once relied on, whether it's our job, our relationships, or our own personal plans, might seem to be shaken or disrupted. At first, this may feel uncomfortable or even frightening, but in reality, this is often God's way of gently or forcefully removing the barriers that have kept us from the fullness of what He wants for us. Like a potter reshaping clay, God uses His favor to mold us, refine us, and redirect us where we need to go. This kind of shaking can be deeply unsettling, but it is part of the renewal process that is necessary for spiritual growth and alignment with God's purpose for our lives. This renewal is not always a smooth, painless process. The Bible gives us many examples of people whose lives were radically changed by God's favor, and these transformations often came with difficulty. Think of the Israelites, who were chosen by God and granted His favor, but who had to endure years of wandering in the desert before they could enter the promised land. Their journey wasn't easy, but it was a process of renewal. During their time in the wilderness, God was teaching them to trust Him, to obey Him, and to rely on His provision. The shaking they experienced wasn't meant to break them, but to prepare them for the blessing that awaited them. Through their trials, God refined their character and realigned their hearts with His purposes. Similarly, in our own lives, God's favor can shake us out of complacency, urging us to reevaluate the things we prioritize and the ways we spend our time, energy, and resources. Sometimes we become so focused on our own plans, our careers, or our personal desires that we lose sight of the bigger picture. God's favor disrupts this narrow focus, calling us to see beyond our immediate needs and concerns to embrace a higher calling. His favor calls us to align our hearts with His kingdom and to seek His righteousness above all else. This realignment can be difficult because it often means surrendering things that we have held dear. things that we might have placed our security in. Yet, as we let go of these temporary things, we make space for God to fill us with His everlasting purposes. God's favor, when it shakes things up, also has the power to break unhealthy patterns and systems in our lives. We may have become stuck in toxic cycles, whether in relationships, habits, or even ways of thinking, that keep us from moving forward. God's favor disrupts these cycles, breaking the chains of sin, fear, or self-reliance that have held us captive. This is part of the process of renewal, breaking free from the old and stepping into the new. As we experience God's favor, we are given the strength and courage to face the areas of our lives that need transformation, whether it's healing from past wounds, overcoming addiction, or breaking free from negative thought patterns. God's favor empowers us to walk in freedom, and that freedom is often the result of a shaking that shifts our hearts and minds toward a new way of living. The renewal brought about by God's favor is not only personal, but can also extend to our families, communities, and even the broader society. Just as individuals experience transformation, entire groups of people can be affected when God's favor is at work. We see this in the Bible through the story of King David. When David was chosen by God and anointed as king, his reign brought about significant renewal in Israel. He was a man after God's own heart, and under his leadership, Israel experienced a season of peace and prosperity. The favor of God on David's life did not just change him, it changed the nation. Likewise, when we allow God's favor to shake up our lives and realign us with His will, we can be agents of change in our communities. Whether it's through acts of kindness, service, or simply living in alignment with God's values, we can become instruments of renewal in the world around us. In addition to personal and communal renewal, God's favor also shakes up our understanding of success and purpose. Often the world defines success by wealth, status, or achievements, but God's favor invites us into a radically different kind of success, a success that is defined by faithfulness, obedience, and love. This shift in perspective can be unsettling, especially if we have built our lives around the pursuit of material success. When God's favor disrupts our understanding of success, it leads us to embrace a more eternal perspective. We begin to realize that true fulfillment doesn't come from what we achieve, but from living in alignment with God's will and serving His purposes. This renewal of our perspective brings peace, joy, and contentment even in circumstances that may seem less than ideal by the world's standards. As we experience the shaking that comes with God's favor, it is important to remember that it is a process of realignment rather than destruction. God's favor doesn't tear us down, it builds us up. The things that feel like a loss or disruption in the moment are often God's way of making space for something greater. Just as a tree must be pruned to bear more fruit, we too must be pruned in order to bear the fruit of the Spirit and fulfill God's calling on our lives. The shaking that God's favor brings may be uncomfortable, but it is necessary for our growth, our transformation, and our renewal. Ultimately, God's favor shakes things up in our lives because He loves us too much to let us remain where we are. He desires to see us become all that we were created to be, and this requires us to be willing to embrace change, challenge, and growth. The renewal that comes through God's favor is a continual process of becoming more like Christ, aligning our hearts with His and stepping into the fullness of His purposes. It is not always easy, but it is always worth it. Through the shaking of His favor, we are not left in chaos. We are brought into a place of greater purpose, peace, and divine alignment. When we think of God's favor, we often imagine blessings, success, and a life of ease. We picture a life in which everything falls into place, doors open without resistance, and all our plans unfold smoothly. While God's favor certainly brings blessings and opportunities, it does not always lead to a life without difficulty. In fact, God's favor often accompanies trials, discomfort, and opposition. These challenges are not evidence of God's absence or abandonment. Rather, they are essential parts of the divine process that shape us into the people God has destined us to be. The presence of difficulty does not negate the presence of God's favor. Instead, it reveals His deeper work in our lives. Consider the story of Joseph, one of the clearest examples of how God's favor works in conjunction with trials. Joseph was a young man favored by his father Jacob, and his dreams of greatness were a sign of God's future plan for him. However, Joseph's journey to fulfillment was far from easy. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. From a human perspective, it seemed as though God's favor had failed him. And yet, Joseph's journey was exactly what God used to mold him into a leader who would save nations. It was during these trials, his time in the pit, his time in slavery, and his time in prison that God shaped Joseph's character, teaching him humility, patience, and trust in God's timing. God's favor didn't spare him from hardship, but it sustained him and positioned him for an extraordinary purpose that would eventually save his family and many others. Similarly, Moses' life demonstrates that God's favor often leads us into places of challenge. Moses was raised as an adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, but he knew he was an Israelite. As he grew older, he became aware of the suffering of his people, and God's favor called him to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. But this divine calling came with monumental opposition. Moses faced rejection from Pharaoh, criticism from his own people, and the weight of leading millions of people through the wilderness. His journey was filled with struggles, doubts, and moments of failure. There were times when Moses questioned his own abilities and times when the Israelites grumbled against him. Yet God's favor was evident throughout this period, not in the absence of challenges, but in the power that enabled Moses to lead his people to freedom. God's favor does not promise an easy road. It promises His presence, His guidance, and the strength to endure. The trials Moses faced were not punishments. They were part of God's refining process, preparing Moses to be the leader who would bring God's people into the promised land. The early church provides another example of how God's favor often comes with opposition. After Jesus ascended into heaven, the apostles were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to spread the message of Christ's resurrection. They were doing the very work they had been commissioned to do, empowered by God's favor. Yet they immediately faced persecution, imprisonment, and threats on their lives. In Acts 5:41, after the apostles were beaten for preaching the gospel, it says the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. This verse captures the paradox of God's favor. Though they were suffering, they were also rejoicing because they understood that the trials they faced were evidence of their divine calling and a part of God's greater plan. The early church did not interpret hardship as a sign of God's absence. Rather, they saw it as a sign that they were walking in the path of divine favor, fulfilling the mission entrusted to them by Christ. The reality is that God's favor often disrupts the status quo, and that disruption can lead to discomfort and even persecution. It can create a divide between those who embrace God's will and those who resist it. When we are walking in God's favor, we are often stepping into territory that challenges the world's values and systems. This can lead to conflict, whether in relationships, at work, or in society at large. God's favor on our lives may make others uncomfortable, and in some cases it may invite criticism or opposition. Jesus himself warned his disciples that following him would not lead to an easy life. In John 15:18-20, he said, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world." The favor of God often calls us to stand apart from the world, and this standing apart can bring discomfort and even persecution. However, it is important to remember that God's favor is not about a trouble-free existence. It is about the capacity to endure and grow through the difficulties. The trials and opposition we face are opportunities for God to refine us and to demonstrate His power in our lives. Just as gold is purified in the fire, our faith is purified through adversity. God's favor does not shield us from trials, it equips us to overcome them. As James 1:2-4 encourages us, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. The key here is that God's favor often operates in a way that transforms our character, deepens our faith, and strengthens our resolve. The trials we face are not meaningless. They have a purpose. They shape us into the people God has created us to be. Trials reveal our weaknesses, but they also provide the opportunity for God's strength to be made perfect in our weakness. It is in these moments of struggle that we often experience God most intimately, as we learn to depend on Him more fully. Furthermore, the challenges that come with God's favor are often a prelude to the great things He wants to accomplish in us and through us. Like Joseph, Moses, and the early church, we may not fully understand the purpose of the trials we face in the moment, but we can trust that God is working behind the scenes. He is preparing us for a greater purpose, and the difficulties are not obstacles to His plan. They are essential steps in His process of shaping and refining us. So while God's favor doesn't promise an easy life, it does promise His presence in every moment. It assures us that even when we face trials and opposition, God is with us, refining us and preparing us for something greater. The challenges we face are not signs of abandonment. They are part of the divine process that molds us into the individuals we are meant to be, enabling us to fulfill the unique purposes God has placed on our lives. Through these trials, we learn to trust God more fully, to lean on His strength, and to hold on to the hope that He is using every situation to refine us and to bring about His good plan. God's favor is a gift that often comes with great responsibility. It is a divine blessing that is not meant to be hoarded for personal gain, but rather to be shared and used for the advancement of God's kingdom and the betterment of others. In a world that places so much value on individual success, wealth, and personal comfort, the concept of God's favor as a tool for service and sacrifice can be countercultural. The favor of God is not about accumulating material possessions or gaining status. It is about using what we have been given to bless others, to build God's kingdom, and to live in a way that reflects His love and purpose. When we read through Scripture, it becomes clear that God's favor is not something that is just for our benefit. It is meant to flow through us to those around us. Take, for example, the story of Abraham. Abraham was chosen by God, and God's favor rested upon him. Yet God's promise to Abraham was not just for his personal prosperity. In Genesis 12:2-3, God tells Abraham, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. God's favor on Abraham was not just about making him wealthy or powerful. It was about using Abraham to be a conduit of blessing to the entire world. Through Abraham, God's favor would extend to future generations, culminating in the blessing of Jesus Christ, through whom all nations are offered salvation. Abraham's role was to receive God's blessing and, in turn, be a blessing to others. Similarly, in the New Testament, we see this principle illustrated in the life of Jesus. Jesus, the Son of God, certainly had the favor of His Father, but His favor was never used for personal gain or comfort. Instead, Jesus used His influence, His power, and His authority to serve others. He healed the sick, raised the dead, fed the hungry, and offered forgiveness to those who were burdened by sin. Jesus, the King of Kings, humbled Himself and took on the form of a servant. He was not concerned with accumulating wealth or power for Himself. Instead, He poured out His life for the sake of others. In Matthew 20:28, Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life as a ransom for many. This is the ultimate example of God's favor being used not for personal comfort, but to bring about the redemption and restoration of humanity. When we receive God's favor, we are invited into the same kind of life. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that God's blessings are meant to satisfy our own desires or to bring us comfort and success. But the Bible consistently teaches that we are blessed to be a blessing. The Apostle Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians 9:8, and God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. The favor of God enables us to do good works, to love others, and to meet the needs of those around us. It's not about accumulating wealth or personal success. It's about being a faithful steward of what God has entrusted to us and using it for His glory and for the good of others. Consider the example of the early church. In Acts 4:30 through 35, we see the believers living in such unity and generosity that they shared everything they had. Those who were blessed with material resources used them to meet the needs of others. The favor of God upon their lives was evident not in their personal wealth or success, but in the way they sacrificially cared for one another. They understood that God's favor was a resource to be used for the flourishing of the community, and they responded by living in radical generosity. The church grew not because of personal gain or individual achievements, but because the believers were committed to serving others and sharing the love of Christ with everyone around them. One of the most powerful aspects of God's favor is that it allows us to have a greater influence on the world around us. We live in a world where influence is often linked to power, wealth, or status. People with influence can often dictate trends, shape cultures, and control outcomes. However, in God's kingdom, true influence comes from a heart of service. When God blesses us with influence, whether through wealth, position, or opportunities, it is not for us to hoard or use for selfish gain. It is given to us so that we can make a positive impact on others. The story of King David illustrates this beautifully. David was a man after God's own heart, and God's favor rested upon him. Yet when David was given power and influence, he used it to serve the people of Israel and to establish justice and righteousness. He didn't use his favor for his own benefit. Instead, he sought to honor God with his leadership. The same principle applies to us today. Whether we have a little or a lot, whether we hold a position of power or have influence in small circles, God has placed us where we are for a reason. His favor is not for us to build our own empire, but to serve others and to bring glory to His name. It may look like giving generously to those in need, offering our time to serve in our communities, or using our talents and skills to bless others. It may involve sharing the gospel with those who don't know Christ, or standing up for justice in a world that often overlooks the marginalized. Whatever form it takes, God's favor is meant to be a tool for bringing about change, hope, and restoration in the lives of those around us. In our modern world, it is easy to get caught up in the pursuit of personal gain, success, and comfort, but God's kingdom operates on a different economy. In God's economy, the more we give, the more we receive. The more we serve, the more we are blessed. The more we bless others, the more we reflect the heart of God. The favor of God is not about seeking our own gain, but about using what He has given us to bring His love and grace to a world that desperately needs it. In conclusion, God's favor is a powerful tool, not for personal accumulation, but for the advancement of His kingdom and the well-being of others. It is a blessing that should flow through us to others, enabling us to serve, uplift, and impact the world for Christ. As we walk in God's favor, we must constantly remind ourselves that it is not about us. It is about Him and His kingdom. May we use the favor we've been given to bless others, to serve selflessly, and to glorify God in everything we do. When God's favor begins to work in our lives, it often initiates a shift, a shaking that unsettles our priorities and reorients our perspective on what truly matters. At first, this shaking may feel uncomfortable, as it challenges the things we have placed at the center of our lives. We may find ourselves rethinking our ambitions, our relationships, and our goals. Yet this is precisely what God's favor does. It shifts our focus from the temporary material things of this world to the eternal, more significant purposes of His kingdom. The favor of God is not simply about receiving blessings. It is about recalibrating our hearts and minds to align with His will and His greater purposes. Through this process, we learn that material wealth, status, and comfort are secondary to living a life that advances God's kingdom. In the natural course of life, it's easy to become consumed with the pursuit of success, wealth, and personal achievement. Our culture often encourages us to climb the social ladder, acquire possessions, and attain personal comfort as signs of a successful and fulfilling life. However, when we experience God's favor, He calls us to examine these values more critically. This shaking doesn't just challenge us to question our materialistic pursuits. It pushes us to reconsider what is truly important. Suddenly, the things that once held our attention may seem less significant. The accolades, the financial gains, and the comforts that we once prioritized may no longer seem as fulfilling when viewed in the light of God's eternal purposes. Our priorities begin to shift, and our focus moves from accumulating things to advancing God's kingdom and serving others. Consider the story of the Apostle Paul. Before his conversion, Paul, then known as Saul, was zealous in his pursuit of status, power, and recognition within the Jewish religious system. He was a highly respected Pharisee, and his reputation and position in society were of utmost importance to him. However, when he encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, everything changed. God's favor didn't just give Paul a new mission, it shook his priorities to their core. In Philippians 3:7-8, Paul writes, "But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ." This dramatic shift in priorities was a direct result of encountering God's favor and His call. Paul had once valued his status, his education, and his accomplishments, but after experiencing the favor of God, he realized that these things were insignificant in comparison to knowing Christ and advancing His kingdom. The shaking Paul experienced didn't just redirect his life, it reordered his values. This reordering of priorities isn't always an easy process. It can be uncomfortable, and it often requires letting go of things that once seemed essential. As we grow in our understanding of God's favor, we may find that we are called to make sacrifices.